Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us on a Monday afternoon. We are all very lucky to live where we do. Australia is a beautiful country, so it's important for us to acknowledge the lands and take a moment to thank the traditional custodians. From wherever you are today, join me in paying respects to their elders, past and present, and let's extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. Please feel free to get comfortable. Today's webinar is brought to you by DVE Business Solutions. Some of you are familiar with us, and I can see that some of you are new. So welcome back. And for those who are new, DVE is a specialist consulting company with over 18 years of experience helping providers in higher education Australia. It's something we genuinely enjoy doing. DVE can help you with all your digital transformation, org improvement, and governance and compliance needs. If you have not visited us online recently, I encourage you to head over to our webpage where we have a number of helpful resources, case studies, testimonials from past work, and other free materials such as templates readily available for download. On that note, please put down your notepads or keyboards as today's webinar will be recorded. We have previously provided 2 other webinars on re-registration, what's required, and the tips, tricks, and war stories from those who have successfully submitted re-registration with TEQSA. You can find these and today's webinar on our Learning Hub webpage. Your pre-submitted questions have been collected, and while some of these will likely be addressed during discussion with our panelists, we will have dedicated time at the end for some Q&A. If anything pops up for you during the webinar, please feel free to type your questions in the chat and we will do our best to answer those today as well. I'll say this again, we enjoy what we do at DVE. If you find you still need support or have questions following the webinar, it is absolutely free to reach out to our team online or over on LinkedIn, via email, and we can schedule a time for a no obligation chat. My name is Claire Holmes and I am one of the Senior Governance and Compliance Consultants with DVE, and I love hearing from providers, so please do reach out even if you are just needing a soundboard to start. Now, let's introduce you to our panelists. Heather Sainsbury is a seasoned higher education consultant with more than 25 years of experience guiding universities through rigorous external quality audits and TEQSA re-registration renewals. Specializing in standards, quality assurance, policy, and governance, she has steered multiple higher education institutions, including Macquarie University, Deakin, and the University of Wollongong, successfully through complex regulatory reviews. Combining deep sector expertise with a clear strategic approach, Heather is now a member of our DVE team and helps other providers navigate accreditation challenges and strengthen their compliance framework. Thank you for joining us today, Heather.
My pleasure.
And I'm really pleased to introduce Dominic Reardon. Dominic is a highly experienced governance professional who works with higher education providers to lift their performance and educational quality. Over the years, he's helped providers strengthen their governance, quality, risk management, and compliance. He's led and managed quality assurance at a major Australian university across operations both onshore and offshore. And along the way, he has founded and convened a network of 100 quality assurance professionals from right across the sector. Dominic brings a rare mix of backgrounds: lawyer, investigator, reviewer, and governance professional. Most importantly, for today, he's overseen re-registration submission. So he knows firsthand what you're looking for as an executive leader when you're guiding your team through narrative writing. And we'll use a number of terms today for our audience. When we refer to narrative writing, the 10-page narrative, we are, of course, referring to TEQSA's self-assurance report. Thank you for being here today, Dominic.
Thanks, Claire.
Now, we have broken down today's webinar into 4 pillars for you: common challenges in narrative drafting, connecting governance and quality assurance frameworks to the HESF, evidence curation, which is something that has popped up a lot in the questions that we have received, and practical insights. Let's get started with the first pillar, common challenges and narrative drafting. The self-assurance report is the heart of the application, and TEQSA reads it for evidence of genuine oversight. We can all agree a narrative that asserts quality without demonstrating it is the most common reason providers are asked for further information from TEQSA. Heather, you have first-hand experience in drafting and reviewing narratives. What are the most common drafting pitfalls senior execs should watch out for when their teams are drafting their 10-page re-registration narratives?
Well, thanks, Claire. Let me just start by saying that, surprise, writing a narrative is not a creative writing exercise. It's a factual description of how a provider complies with the threshold standards and relevant criteria. And they're hard to write. They're high stakes, they're often time pressured, and they require input from across the institution. Now, most of the pitfalls, I think, stem from two main things. First of all, gaps in the evidence to support your claims and demonstrate self-assurance, and then a lack of an institutional coherence in your narrative. So with that in mind, let me start you with an issue that I've often seen. The first pitfall number one, inclusion of assertions without evidence. So narratives should never include unsubstantiated claims of quality or maturity or outcomes. Every claim you make has to be backed up by evidence. So TEQSA is very alert to inconsistency. So where the narrative says one thing and the evidence shows another, then that will raise alarm bells. And even small contradictions can undermine TEQSA's confidence. Now, there's also often a temptation to use marketing style language, for example, best practice, state of the art, in the hope that this will actually signal confidence, but actually it does the opposite and it undermines credibility. So my strong advice is to always use direct, clear, simple, descriptive language without jargon, without unnecessary complexity, and to avoid an overly positive tone. So you can't go too far wrong if you refer back to the language in the standards and be consistent with that. But don't just parrot the standards. You've got to tailor the message to reflect your mission, your scale, your provider category, your level of maturity. And overstating your maturity or your achievement won't impress TEQSA. It's more likely to make reviewers question whether you're telling a realistic story. So that's pitfall number one. This kind of leads on to another common problem, where narratives appear like they're coming from different institutions. You don't have a common, coherent voice. So while all providers have to address all relevant standards and criteria, how you do that depends on your particular context and your developmental stage. So templated generic narratives might signal immaturity and a lack of true understanding of your own strengths and weaknesses, and that doesn't inspire confidence. So your account should reflect your particular, hopefully fit for purpose approach to governance, quality assurance and risk management. Don't assume TEQSA understands your context. You need to show it. And then you've got to make sure you use an institutional voice consistently throughout. So some sections relate to different standards, but they shouldn't read as if they've been written by different people, or worse still, written by different organisations. So all sections should use that consistent tone and terminology and reflect shared understandings of risk management, quality assurance and governance. So there are various ways to do this, either by using one or two main authors, by developing by devolving authorship, but having a central editor or synthesis lead, by engaging external expert reviewers. Range of ways to do it. There's not one size fits all, but either way, you've got to ensure consistent messaging across that narrative. Okay, so while cohesion is important, TEQSA is ultimately looking for substance. So another pitfall that I've encountered is sort of weak evidence of self-assurance. So TEQSA reads self-assurance as a proxy for institutional maturity. It's how they judge whether you understand your own risks. So TEQSA expects all institutions to demonstrate self-assurance in their narrative or self-assurance report, as Claire has said, although this will vary depending on your particular scale or the type of provider that you are. But at a very minimum, TEQSA will expect to see evidence of how you identify risks and monitor and mitigate them, how policies are implemented, evidence of active and informed governance. And then even providers without self-accrediting status need to demonstrate how they assure themselves that courses remain compliant, how they monitor course performance, and how they identify and address risks. So the more mature an organisation is, the higher TEQSA's expectations will be. So providers with self-accrediting status will be expected to demonstrate robust internal accreditation and reaccreditation processes. And of course, and they'll expect a more sophisticated use of data. And of course, any data that you do reference needs to be accurate and current and used to inform decisions. TEQSA will pick up quickly if the data doesn't align with a narrative. Okay, so you've got the evidence, you've got the institutional voice, and now another sort of really practical pitfall or difficulty is the poor use of limited space. 10 pages is tight. Every paragraph counts and has to earn its place. So common issues I've seen include over-description in the narrative, which should just signpost supporting evidence which carries the detail, repetition across sections, failure to prioritise high risk or high impact areas. In particular, you'll need to be sure that you cover off some of the areas that TEQSA has identified as sector-wide risks: corporate academic governance, quality assurance, student support, all of those things that TEQSA sees as really critical in terms of quality. So finally, I think the final pitfall is not allowing enough time. So all of this takes time, and high quality narrative requires early drafting, iterative refinement, collaboration across the institution, and evidence mapping and relevance testing your evidence against your narrative. So rushed narratives show. So, and TEQSA will notice. So they're my 5 major pitfalls. Dom might have something to add to that.
Thanks, Heather. Yeah, look, there's just a few things. I think your summary is fantastic and really covers so many of the key points in this area. You've really emphasised how challenging it is. Obviously, for initial provider registration, 15 pages, currently 10 pages for re-registration. It's obviously a very, very significant task. Couple of things worth thinking about. It is a narrative, so structure is really important. My colleague Jen Sullivan made the great point when I was speaking to her about this webinar, that a narrative is, while we emphasize this is not storytelling, this is not fiction, this is non-fiction, but it does still have to have structure. We need a good introduction, a good grounding around our governance arrangements, risk management, quality assurance, and something that draws that all together. One of the challenges in organisations is that there are multiple stakeholders, and so while the federated approach to re-registration is really important, you need to be drawing on the organisation, the various arms of the organisation. There does need to ultimately be a single voice. And the other thing that I think is a great point that Jan always reminded us of at University of Wollongong is that it is from a governance lens. So in that perspective of governance is the key. That's, as we know, in the old model of the core, we had essentially, academic and corporate governance sitting at the core of the core from the point of view of the threshold standards from TEQSA's perspective. And that's just that real reminder that the academic and corporate governance lens is the lens through which everything really needs to be focused. And I think that's an incredibly important perspective. One thing that I think is a really, really powerful management tool that's really useful in processes like this is the concept of a pre-mortem. So as part of your planning, and Heather alluded to the need for extensive planning, one of the tools and techniques that I've always sounds really interesting. And I think we do this iteratively and naturally, but it's really nice to call it out as a process, is called the pre-mortem. And essentially, it's kind of sitting around at the start of a process. And I think we all have the ideas in our heads. We sort of ask ourselves, well, if this process was unsuccessful, why would it be unsuccessful? And we generally know what the answers are, but it's really good to call them out early in a process and say, okay, these are the things that we will need to address and as part of our preparations, and significantly want to address in our narrative as part of our self-assurance report. They're just a few additional thoughts.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I agree about the importance of good writing and cohesion. That is absolutely critical, and getting that structure that leads TEQSA through the evidence in a logical, structured way. You've got to guide them and point them in the right direction through this logical story. So in that sense, it's a story, but it's not a fiction. It's not fiction, but it's your story. It's your institutional story. So how do you tell that? And you really need to do it well. And every word matters, and good writing matters. So that's why you need to take the time to be iterative, to get someone who really understands what TEQSA expects to see to be involved, and to ensure that it's going to hit the right buttons in a really logical way. Critically, academic corporate governance, absolutely. And that's where after a sort of a contextual statement, which I would provide up front, I would always move on to governance, sort of how, in terms of your corporate and academic governance before you move on. I think that's absolutely at the heart of it, but now through a risk lens as well, and ensuring that all of the risks that TEQSA has identified, well, ones that are particularly to your institution, but also those that TEQSA has seen across the sector, that you're kind of touching on these, that they're little signposts you should look through when you're sort of assigning real estate for this. Have I touched upon academic integrity? Have I appropriately? Have I touched upon my good financial management? Have I touched upon the student experience and some of the issues that have been associated? All of those things that we know are in TEQSA's mind, and to make sure that we pull that back to show how that is overseen by your corporate and your academic governing bodies. So yes, it's a really tight piece of work that needs to be done, and it's worth taking the time and doing it properly to inspire confidence. And it's a good learning exercise for you to work out your own gaps. If you can't tell a logical story, then there's a problem.
Yeah, no, if I could just quickly jump in quickly, Claire, I know we probably want to move on, but when we talk about a pre-mortem, it's the opposite of a post-mortem. A post-mortem is what you do when something has gone wrong. A pre-mortem is what you do in a predictive way. And again, I think Heather's touched on some really key points there, that we all tend to know what our weaknesses are, but it's that process of actually sitting down and essentially calling them out in a really honest way, so that they are the things that we know that we will be needing to work on, and we will need to be describing and providing confidence to TEQSA and our own institutions about.
That's right. You're on the front foot. You're not on the back foot.
This leads us really nicely into pillar 2, connecting governance and quality assurance frameworks to HESF. Once the wheels are turning, the test becomes whether your daily practice can be traced back to the threshold standards. An institution can have a pristine framework mapped tightly to specific standards on paper, but TEQSA really wants to see how it lives across domains 5 and 6. Dominic, how can you touch a little bit more on how do we successfully connect daily practices to the threshold standards?
Okay, well, when we talk about frameworks, all of us, all of our organisations will have different ways of thinking about that and different ways of articulating that. One of the key elements for practitioners really close to this space is obviously the idea that we understand and map the standards, and we map the standards in an iterative way, in an ongoing way against our practice. Again, thinking about the idea of academic and corporate governance being the core of the core, what that really looks like is in ways that can be quite static, like terms of reference for committees and committee structures and the way in which responsibilities might be mapped across our academic and corporate committee structures. But where it really turns, where the evidence really becomes real is the ways in which the flow of information, the flow of papers, the flow of decisions, the flow of inquiry, the flow of follow-up, the flow of loop closing happens in practice as part of the operations of those committees, and where information essentially is introduced, handled, and ultimately resolves and resides. A lot of that, again, can come down to some really key considerations around the effectiveness of our committees, some really honest and thoughtful consideration about when our committees are considering the various aspects of work that they are doing as part of our self-assurance practices. What does that actually mean? What we can always think about in the lead up to a re-registration process, for example, is, let's put it this way. One of the more oft-used phrases in committees that we need to think about is, I'll take the papers as read, I have a few remarks to make, and is there any discussion, engagement, consideration of the papers? Those practices, which are all about the tension of committees. They've got busy agendas, lots and lots of information to process. But the question that TEQSA is going to be thinking about is, well, is this committee appropriately constituted? Has it properly engaged with this material? Is there evidence that issues have been called out, risks have been identified, issues identified have been isolated and actioned for further investigation and further action as required? These are all the sorts of issues that essentially allow an institution to articulate an active and engaged governance framework that makes a lot of difference. And that's right across our activities, the things that we're reporting on a routine basis, ensuring that there's good engagement, ensuring that the committees are appropriately constituted, have the right voices, have some independent voices that can make a difference, and can are prepared perhaps to more actively call out and expect answers and resolution on issues that are perhaps not working as well as they might. Yeah. Another thing in terms of planning, very quickly, and I'll throw it to you, Heather, is that typically too, in our thinking about evidence here, we are often engaged in both a TEQSA re-registration process as a provider and a CRICOS process. And again, that's something that can, in the planning process, again, sort of expose some weaknesses around our frameworks and practices that do need to be resolved. And that can create a real logistical challenge for institutions as well. So given that I think most institutions have tried to align CRICOS and TEQSA re-registration as best they can, that does have some advantages, but also presents some challenges in terms of connecting practice to compliance and evidencing that in good ways. Over to you.
Yes. Okay, I just want to reinforce your point about how important it is to show how governance bodies use information and not just receive it. I've seen reviewed quite a number of minutes where it isn't clear that the corporate or academic governing bodies have actually engaged. So, so you get these perfunctory comments in the minutes. Obviously minutes are not a transcript, but you at least got to show that there's a genuine active engagement with the information that's put to them to enable informed decision making. But for that to happen, you actually need good reports. So, early on in the processes that I've been involved in, we've gone back and looked at the kind of reporting that's going through to your academic board, the reporting that's going through to your council or other corporate governing body. And is that actually the right information? Is it sufficient? Is it is it critical? Does it have analysis? Is it just throwing data without any kind of analysis that would lead to the right questions being asked by the members of our governing bodies? So I think that's really important. Like early on, you think of, well, which are we getting the reports that we need to go through? What is the quality of those reports? What kind of reporting is? I think the annual agenda plans for these bodies are absolutely
Yes.
critical evidence, because that's where you plan what goes through on a regular basis, what goes through then potentially on an ad hoc basis to address sort of new or emerging risks. But that is really, really quite critical. But if you don't give the right information, good quality information, and if TEQSA doesn't see, if you offer up a report as a sample in your evidence that doesn't have good data, that doesn't have good analysis, that doesn't identify systemic issues, that doesn't say how you're going to address those systemic issues, then that's not going to support good governance.
No.
And not show action, how you really translate the standards into self-assurance, real self-assurance in practice.
This
And
is
there's
why. Oh, sorry, Dominic.
just very quickly again, just to really reiterate that I use the word a kind of a federated approach to re-registration, and again, I think Heather's touched on some brilliant points there that really underline that. Good relationships between, if you are in that kind of quality assurance TEQSA re-registration area, good relationships with your corporate and academic governance folk if you are not specifically responsible for that. Good relationships with your colleagues who crunch the data in your organisation, and good relationships with your research training and research office. All of those areas are your friends and your and are critical to success. There needs to be a leader. There needs to be a single voice, ultimately, in terms of presenting that to TEQSA. But that federated approach is absolutely critical.
I was just going to add to this discussion that this is why those mandatory corporate and academic governance reviews are really important in helping identify and rectify any of those structural gaps that come up ahead of putting your self-assurance report together. Yeah. Moving into, I did have a follow-up question on this for Dominic, but I might save it to the Q&A, and because I'm just conscious of time, and we have so much to cover here, and I know this is something that we could easily turn into like a half day webinar. So we've really tried to pull out all of the high level details for you all today.
Can I just raise one point about those external review reports? Timing here is quite critical, and it's often hard to sort of work out what is the best time. You want to put your best foot forward to the external reviewer as well, so that enormous gaps aren't sort of revealed and become public. But on the other hand, you've got to have time to really engage with those reports and start the rectification process. And if not, having completed that rectification, to have really good evidence that you're well on the way and you have a plan to rectify. So I think timing there it's a bit of a balance, but don't leave it too late. I just wanted to make that point.
I think it was something Dominic said when we first got together to discuss putting this webinar together and it just really stuck with me, Dominic, is TEQSA doesn't expect things to be perfect. They really don't. But we have this innate feeling or purpose that we have to make everything appear perfect when we're airing out our dirty laundry, so to speak. So,
Really. As I mean, again, Heather's sort of hit the nail on the head talking about, states of maturity. We might say that in the purest legal sense, we're all judged against standards, but we know in reality that the expectations that TEQSA has are modulated by the size and scope and experience and standing of organisations. But it's incumbent upon us to also be engaged in that process of self-reflection and improvement, and that's really about where the opportunities are to to demonstrate, active engagement with risk, active and effective plans for mitigation of risk. Obviously, risk has been massively elevated as a thematic consideration in the approach that TEQSA takes, but in many other areas as well.
Okay.
Moving into pillar 3, curated evidence and practice in action. This is where many providers hit roadblocks such as time, people, and capacity. TEQSA's revised approach, as you've touched on, Dominic, deliberately narrows the evidence it asks for. So the evidence you do submit must work harder. Each claim in the report needs to be backed by curated evidence and listed in the accompanying index. Strong submissions are going to pair data with those committee minutes, while analysis and action trackers show the data was actually considered and acted upon. Heather, TEQSA has made it clear that data is an illustration, not an explanation. And I'm acutely aware that sounds like a great t-shirt slogan. How should institutions curate evidence to demonstrate authentic practice?
Okay, well, that's an interesting question. Well, number one, yes, this is often where the rubber hits the road, and you might have real road blocks in terms of your time, capacity, people, sheer effort to pull all this, to pull evidence together and to curate and make decisions about that evidence. And Dom's already referred to the importance of this sort of federated collegial approach across the university to get the right evidence. So a strong submission shouldn't overwhelm TEQSA with volume. It's got to provide the right evidence. Obviously, that's clearly signposted in the narrative to show how the institution knows it's compliant. So that's why, as we've already said, your frameworks under domains 5 and 6 are critical, because these are the domains that generate much of the evidence that TEQSA is going to rely on. But there's a few important questions. When you're curating and making the decision, there's a couple of questions I'd ask to help inform your decisions. First question is the evidence necessary to support a claim made in the narrative? So, as we've already said, an unsupported claim can't stand, and it'll raise concerns for TEQSA. So you either take out the statement, or if it's important to make that point, then you've got to provide the evidence to support it. So, so the evidence needs to align seamlessly with a narrative, not contradict it, not even just sit beside it, but actually support it. The two have to speak to each other. So that's really, your story will dictate the evidence you need to support that story. So that's the first thing to bear in mind. The next question is, okay, well, is the evidence sufficient to demonstrate the full cycle of self-assurance? So TEQSA is looking for evidence that shows that issues identified, actions taken, outcomes are monitored, and improvements are demonstrated. So are you showing that cycle of self-assurance that is expected by all providers at one level or another, depending on their maturity, scale, and their particular provider category? So this is the strongest indicator of maturity. And it's where domain 6 again becomes really critical, because TEQSA wants to see that issues are escalated, discussed, followed through by governing bodies, and not just noted. So that's the next question to ask. Now, the next question is the evidence deep enough for high-risk areas? So obviously, the higher the risk, the deeper the evidence you'll need to provide. So don't waste space on things that can be dealt with sort of more in a more straightforward way. You can have lighter evidence for some risks, but some of the critical ones that to where TEQSA will expect multiple sources and clear governance oversight are areas such as academic integrity, third-party delivery, if that's a thing for you, assessment quality, financial viability, student safety and wellbeing, all of those and other risks that TEQSA has identified as key risks. And of course, any risks that they've identified for your particular institution. The other question is to ask about your evidence is, well, is the evidence current? Don't include evidence that's not current. And is it consistent across, your dashboards, reports, minutes? So if you're putting in evidence, that you've got to look at it against the full story and against the other evidence and if there's gross inconsistencies, then that's going to raise alarm bells for TEQSA. So you don't want, because it means you don't really understand your risks and you've got a poorly developed understanding of how to manage your risks. So cleaning your evidence there is also important. So if you realise that some of your evidence isn't current or it's not consistent, if you can in advance identify those issues and look to providing better, cleaner, more consistent reports, then that anticipate that. And always have that in the back of the mind. Even if you don't provide information to TEQSA, you don't provide them with the document, they can ask for anything in your list. You've got to be prepared for that and make sure that everything speaks to it. All the bits of evidence speak to each other. And then my final question is, does the evidence show effective governance? So evidence of good governance is one of the strongest indicators of institutional maturity, and it's often the difference between a submission that feels credible and one that feels a bit superficial. So TEQSA will expect to see reports provided to academic board and your corporate governing bodies, minutes that show discussion, challenge, follow-up, evidence of oversight of risks, performance and compliance. And so this is what demonstrates that your systems are not just designed well on paper, but are actually being used and hopefully used well.
Dominic, do you have anything to further to add to that? I know that you were the former director of governance for the university, and when the self-assurance report was being put together by Heather, you oversaw both that narrative writing piece and the re-registration submission itself. What did you find actually helped you ensure that messaging and the evidence of the governing body actively assuring itself came across rather than just merely asserting it?
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, you've just popped yourself back on mute.
Sorry. I think the points Heather's made are excellent, and I don't really have an awful lot to add to those. I think that the bringing together a kind of a single voice, having a sense that one of the things I think that was really useful is coming out of that kind of pre-mortem type process, we had a clear sense of where our areas of weakness were, and we were essentially, as part of our planning and preparation, building towards a situation where we were able to assert with greater confidence that issues identified were essentially being managed, risks were being mitigated, issues were being addressed, loops were being closed. That's probably so. I think sort of organisations tend to sort of start this process with I mean, it's critical that you have a fairly honest self-assessment of where you're standing, and there are typically then a whole series of allied processes and projects and initiatives that are essentially running. And this all has to happen in the context of the fact that the organisation's got to keep running. I think one of the things that's so challenging for so many of the universities that submitted their applications in the last 2 or 3 years is that was done while essentially planes were being rebuilt and redesigned in flight to cope with the implications, the washout of the COVID-19 pandemic, the various shifts in direction and policy around international students, the sudden embrace of offshore operations. All of these things, essentially, I think one of the things that's really interesting to think about at the strategic level in organisations is well, how brave do we want to be in and around the period where we're engaging with TEQSA and seeking re-registration? I think most organisations have really made it quite clear that they've got to keep going and they've got to keep working, and that means that there will be often, significant and quite risky exercises and initiatives underway in parallel to a TEQSA re-registration. You have to incorporate that and demonstrate that you are managing those things
Yeah.
in a serious and effective way.
Yeah, agreed. TEQSA doesn't expect and wouldn't want organisations to remain static. They expect us to be responding to risks, trialling innovation, as long as there's appropriate management of those risks. So that's the critical. Is there appropriate corporate and/or governance oversight over those initiatives, over those changes? And as long as you can provide evidence that you've got good processes in place in terms of how you're managing those, then that's fine. That's absolutely fine. So if we want to improve, if we want to remain viable, if we want to continue to provide the best possible educational and student experience, then we need to innovate. And sometimes that might take a little bit for TEQSA to get their head around, but that's fine too. It just might require a bit more explanation, a bit more supporting evidence to explain what you're doing, that it's compliant with the standards, and you've got good ways of managing potential or real risks associated with that initiative.
Mm. Thanks for that, Heather. Uh, Wrapping up into pillar 4 now, practical sector insights and timelines. Let's talk about the engine room, the planning. Re-registration must be lodged at least 180 days before the current period ends, and TEQSA recommends governance reviews fall in that second half of the registration period. So the practical moves made in those 18 to 24 months out largely determine the quality of the eventual submission. In DVE's experience, planning backwards from the submission date, and Dominic spoke to this earlier, and using the runway to evidence improvements already implemented is what separates a clean 7-year renewal from one that attracts conditions or a costly compliance assessment. Dominic, for the executives in our audience who are within that time frame of the 18 months to 2 years out from submission, what are the immediate pragmatic moves they should be making right now?
Well, a cunning plan always helps. So that's absolutely your starting point. And yeah, essentially recognizing that the institution will continue. Building that federation, that's the second thing. I've talked about that kind of federation of allies, that group of key individuals that sets aside time and effort and thought to assist in the process. And that's, your folk for providing data, your folk managing research quality, your folk managing corporate governance, academic governance, and
Risk management.
indeed. So essentially, and look, one of the pitfalls there, I think, again, just in deference to my colleague and Heather's former colleague, Jan Sullivan, who managed the 2 re-registration processes I managed at the University of Wollongong. I mean, she was incredibly effective and highly credible officer. And sometimes the curse of credibility is the thing that gets you, because you have difficulty engaging with your colleagues because they say, "Oh, you've got it all under control." And I think it's really, one of the soft skills in this space is still being able to say to people, "Look, we do need you. We do need you to scrutinise what we're doing. We need that work." We had a big offshore platform, a big offshore campus footprint at Wollongong, and one of the things that was really critical, if you work offshore or in multi-site arrangements, which are obviously the norm for many providers, big and small these days, is that there is, again, a sense of understanding right across the institution. So I was in the last round. Essentially, we had done kind of compliance assessments for all of our offshore operations, and we essentially went and kicked the tires. And there was evidence from TEQSA that they expected that. They didn't really, post COVID, with the cost of travel and the reliance we have on means of like this to communicate, it really wasn't enough for them. They really expected that we were on the ground and engaging with our colleagues and all our major offshore delivery locations to make sure that things were doing well. So having time and space there. Critical thing for us too is, I think there's no question that doing your corporate and academic independent corporate governance and academic governance reviews early, to give yourself some time and space to demonstrate not only that they are done, but that you are working towards implementing the recommendations that may emerge from those. And I also mentioned, of course, that the re-registration process under CRICOS is a much more administratively detailed, driven, and quite sort of fungible sort of aspect of the organisation. It's much more about the way we do things and the way we conduct a lot of administrative processes. Having that on the go alongside, I want to call out the need for you to make good assessments of what resources you require, and making sure that you build those into your budgets, and that you've got commitment from the executive to support the people who will be doing the work, and making sure that everybody has the right bid. Because if your colleagues in one particular area are also going to be particularly pressed, a bit of confession here, a lot of organisations tend to have, shall we say, patchy performance around, say, for instance, keeping their policies up to date. If you have a major policy refresh that needs to be done in the 2 years leading to re-registration, that's going to take a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of resource. So again, kind of working through those kind of resource demands are really, really critical. Making sure that you've got a good handle on things like your governance effectiveness surveys, your sort of self-reflection surveys that are coming out of your key governance bodies, to show that they're continuing to be engaged with and reflecting on their own performance, and the criticality as well of the risk register, making sure that it's alive, it's continued to infiltrate the organisation, drive attention on key issues, key risks, and is demonstrably covering those kind of key risks across both organisational, operational, and academic areas. So that'd be some of the things I'd really call out in terms of sort of managing the process and giving the senior executive assurance that the process is being well managed in the lead up to submission.
Yeah. I reiterate the importance of planning and proper project planning, with a project lead, a project team, with clear accountabilities, so that it's really followed through on using project approach. And then as part of that, of course, you've got the communication piece and pulling in your key stakeholders and getting them in the loop early, having the conversations, getting your chair of academic board involved, getting the head of compliance involved. So those relationships are key, and you've got to get those people on board early on, so that they're your partners in this process. And so you need a communication plan. You'll need to start feeding information to your corporate and academic governing bodies, to your executive group, and to the broader community, so that everybody has confidence, understands what's happening. They're on board. They will help drive whatever needs to be driven to make sure you're well placed for a successful process. So line up your ducks early and get people on board early. You might want to establish a steering group with some really key players. They could be some members of the executive plus some other people at the next tier, your key governance, your secretary, or your governance important governance and compliance people, but that's really important to have that steering group, because you can use that group to test your evidence, to test your drafts, and also to say, actually, this isn't happening and it needs to happen. Can you please, get them on board, and they can, it's kind of soft power, soft leadership in a way. You can't tell people what to do, but you've got to get people on board who can tell people what to do to make things happen. So that's really important.
It helps with that
And
unifying voice too.
yeah. And just one thing too, I think is really important is that there are resources available in the sector. There are services like the paid for services like DVE, and there are others as well that will assist organisations with this process. And the other thing, can I say, just as a little plug for my former higher education network, benchmarking and being connected across the sector with what's going on, and asking your colleagues and having a network. So, I mean, there's a good private provider network. There are private and public providers in the network that I used to run that's still going. We used to really get a lot of benefit out of that, just talking about the experiences we were having and sharing experience. And that's a really important thing as well. We're all essentially in it together. We're a competitive sector in some respects, but in many respects, we're a cooperative sector, and we like to be collegial, and that's a really, really valuable resource as well.
Shared knowledge. I am aware that we have 9 minutes left for Q&A. So our challenge is we're going to burn through these as quickly as possible. And what I might do, if everybody is open to this, anything that we don't get to today that myself and the panelists have found particularly interesting and gritty with the questions, I might look at putting together just a really short Q&A that we can post up with the webinar. So let's get straight into it. Heather, what are TEQSA guidelines for courses covered under self-accrediting authority? How should this be presented?
Okay. Well, TEQSA expects self-accrediting organisations to operate with the same discipline and evidence that TEQSA would apply if it were accrediting the course. So it'll expect the self-assurance report to provide information relating that describes a defensible internal course accreditation system, clear academic governance, oversight, independent academic scrutiny, evidence-based decision-making, documented criteria aligned to the HESF, just the usual things you would expect and that are required by the standards. It'll also expect to see regular monitoring, review and continuous improvement, like your periodic course reviews, use of student outcomes data, closing the loop on identified issues. It'll be looking for your ability to manage risk. For example, how are academic integrity, assessment quality, student outcomes assured? If you have third-party arrangements, how is delivery by third parties monitored? That's quite important. And then coming back to a point we've made again and again in this webinar, the importance of governance visibility, clear reporting on course performance, evidence of risk monitoring, assurance that internal accreditation decisions are sound. So basically, you're self-assuring. So you can only do that if you have the right information and the right processes for assuring quality and standards. So you'll need to provide evidence that you have the systems, policies and processes, procedures that you then actually implement to make that happen.
Thank you, Heather. This next question I'm going to throw to you, Dominic, and I just want to preface this by saying that, and I probably should have said this at the start of the webinar, we are not TEQSA. We are not employed by TEQSA. We are a private consulting firm to Higher Education Australia. But I think this is a very interesting question nonetheless. So Dominic, what role do you think SREs and TEQSA's regulatory risk framework will play in future registration renewals? Will TEQSA expect to see responses less focused on standards and more focused on risk areas?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, the honest answer is we don't really know. It's a $64,000 question. What I believe we entitled to assume is that the SREs, the statements of regulatory expectation, will play a more salient role than the role that has previously been played by guidance notes, which, as we know, to some annoyance among colleagues across the sector, have occasionally reached the status of almost as kind of a standard level status in TEQSA's mind. I think that TEQSA, in fair play to it, is obviously trying to attach a greater level of salience to the SRE as a kind of a way of explaining and expressing its expectations. So I think we're behoved to pay close attention to them. I think the regulatory risk framework is a really interesting piece. I think it's really clear that thematically risk is really at the forefront now, and so everything we've said about ensuring that your internal risk processes are strong and robust and are enmeshed across the institution can't be emphasised enough. TEQSA has called out that it will make changes to the re-registration process as it implements the regulatory risk framework. So we know it's going to have an effect. And we know that our best guess at this stage is to say that risk has taken on almost a kind of a preeminent sort of standing as a sort of a thematic shaper of TEQSA's approach. TEQSA's also, though, called out the risk that the RRE, the RRF, the regulatory risk framework, should not become a checklist. But the power of the RRF, I think, is going to be as a benchmarking tool and as a kind of a more explicit sort of way of placing yourself on the spectrum of maturity. And I think clearly what we're going to see is a tendency now to say that in our preparations, plotting ourselves in an honest way against the RRF tables of risk maturity is going to be a really good indicator and is inevitably going to shape institutions. But I have to say a little bit of caution there because TEQSA is clearly signalling it's going to have an impact. That's my best guess about how it might impact. I don't know, Heather, have you got any views on that one?
Yeah. Look, the regulatory risk framework and the standards are aligned. They're ultimately, you've got to meet the standards. That's your requirement. And this is kind of like a lens or a focus that gives you some indicators of what might be expected in terms of how you meet the standards. So the regulatory risk framework isn't going to replace the standards by any means. You still have to show that you meet all relevant standards and criteria. But this will be kind of like and I think for a few years now, we've been aware that our submissions need to show that risk lens across the standards, because this conversation about risk has been going on for a while, even though it's only recently that we've seen we've had the consultation on the draft framework. But so I don't think the two are exclusive. Mutually exclusive. You still must explicitly address every standard and criteria, but you frame your narrative through that risk lens. So if you can show TEQSA that you understand your risks and sort of reflecting the language that's used in the RFF, and you can explain your risks without defensiveness, then that will stand you in good stead. And so I guess this, as you said, it's not a checklist, but it's kind of an indicator of where you might sit in terms of your maturity and what you might need to be strengthening going forward, particularly if you're going to be moving towards self-accrediting status.
One last quick question. I'm going to take a question that has come through to us on the chat. Kiara is going to keep our webinar up a little bit longer in order for us to answer this question. So this has come in from one of the attendees and is addressed to both of you. How can a private higher education provider best demonstrate that comprehensive course reviews are driving measurable improvements in student outcomes rather than simply meeting policy requirements?
That's a fantastic question. And one I think I'd say both Heather and I have pondered many, many, many times. And the reason it's a great question is that it's not a closed system, a course. It's a very complex thing, or a degree, or a program, whatever we want to call it. But I think that what you have to be realistic about is that it's an incredibly dynamic system, the offering of a course. There are immense numbers of variables in what happens in a course. So your question goes to, well, I made a series of recommendations and what impact did they have? And that's a really, really, really interesting question. There is, I can tell you straight off the top of my head, some evidence that one could procure around student performance, student satisfaction. Obviously, there are data points that you could draw. But the reason I say it's a complex question and one shouldn't over-egg that is that I would say in my experience, you would see a faculty do a course review, and then a year later, there's a change of dean, and suddenly they want to redirect and redesign the course. So I think in talking to TEQSA about that, you have to contextualize the fact that there are so many variables. There might be a sudden growth or drop in popularity for that course. There might be a change in admission standards. There might be competitive pressures to alter admission requirements for that course. There are so many variables that it's really, really difficult to say, we did this and the effect of that was. But don't ever ignore something that can very, very easily be ignored, which is that your course review or your degree or program review process is like it's a quality process in and of itself, and you've got to have really good loop closing processes. You can't be sitting around for the 5, 6, or 7 up to 7 years that it takes to next review that
Not
course
address the recommendation.
and not consider the progress that the faculty is making recommendations. That said, the realities of courses are that very few are staying still for very long these days. There is movement all the time, and you have to be realistic about that, but you have to be able to explain that. So it's a great question. Sorry, it's a complex answer. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, but importantly, you need governance oversight of all of these processes. So that's absolutely quite critical, how you're reporting through to academic board and your corporate governing body in terms of your course performance, in terms of your course reviews, in terms of your student satisfaction monitoring, all of those things that you're doing that will inform, that give you data or information that will inform course improvement. Your governing bodies need to be monitoring that. So that I've seen that as a gap in some people's, it could lead to a condition if you don't have a course review process, a scheduled course reviews, that you don't have ongoing monitoring. You could end up with a TEQSA condition, but your corporate and academic governance bodies need to be on top of it and be kept in the loop with what you're doing.
Dominic and Heather, thank you so much for your time this afternoon and for being with us. To our attendees, thank you for hanging around and spending your afternoon with us. We will see you at the next webinar, or you can see us again on our Learning Hub webpage. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Claire. Great session.
Pleasure. Bye-bye.